Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 2024 student debate. Which presidential candidate would be best for Gen Z? Brought to you by the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, make sure you silence your cell phones or any devices that may make noise during the debate. Please note that during this debate portion, audience members are not permitted to boo, to applaud, to holler, to make any kind of noise. Those who disrupt the debate will not be given a warning. If you disrupt the debate, you will be asked to leave. Moderating tonight's proceedings is Chuck Todd. Chuck is NBC News chief political analyst and a visiting Pritzker fellow this quarter at the IOP. He's also a former moderator of NBC's flagship Sunday public affairs program, Meet the Press. Arguing tonight for Vice President Kamala Harris is Kate Davis, a fourth year in the college from New York City and co-president of the UC Democrats. Arguing for former President Trump will be Christopher Phillips, a fourth year from Southern California and president of College Republicans. At the conclusion of this 50-minute debate, we will turn to 15 minutes of Q&A with Chuck Todd and the student participants. Priority for questions, as always, will go to UC students. Now, please welcome Chuck, Kate, and Christopher to the stage.
Well, welcome to this debate. Let me get through the ground rules really quick. We did a coin flip to see who gets to speak first and who gets the first question. Kate Davis will speak first, and Chris Phillips will get to answer the first question. I'm going to divide things up into 4 general pods, and in each one we'll spend about 10 minutes in each of those pods, just to give you a guideline of the issue pods I'll be doing, and they've heard this as well. We'll have a section on economic issues, a section on sort of personal rights issues, a section on sort of security, which I throw climate into that, as well as the border, and then America's role in the world. So with that, Ms. Davis won the toss, and she will give the first opening statement. It's 1-minute opening statements. They'll get 90 seconds to respond to every question I give, and they'll each get 30-second follow-ups at my discretion.
I'm gonna fix this one moment.
Oh.
I can't see the clock.
Yeah. That's okay.
Sure.
I'm 5'1", it's a struggle. Okay, thank you.
We didn't negotiate the size of these, you know. There was some back and forth, and now I know we're gonna have to raise his podium. No, I kid. And so with that, we are formally beginning the debate with your 1-minute opening statement to Ms. Davis.
Good evening, everyone. Before I dive into a substantive policy debate, let me just tell you a little bit about why I'm here today. The only reason that I get to be up on this stage debating in front of Chuck Todd is because my parents could afford access to health insurance that provided me with an incredible team of doctors who saved my life multiple occasions as I battled pediatric leukemia. I am so proud to be a cancer survivor, but every day I am reminded of the countless kids I know who lost the battle and didn't have the same shot that I did. Kamala Harris knows that healthcare isn't a privilege, it's a human right. She believes that everyone in this country should have the right to a healthy life and the right to autonomy over their body. I am so thankful to be here today. And I know Kamala is going to make sure that all young people, whether it's paying for your grocery bill, your first home, or your education, will make sure that we have a fair shot too. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Phillips, your opening statement.
Well, thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Kate. Thanks to you all for being here. I'm very excited. 70% of Americans believe that this country is headed in the wrong direction. To the members of Gen Z in the audience tonight, and to those watching on the live stream at home, just know that actually, I have a little secret for you. We're going to be the ones who actually save this country. In 2020, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden received about 60% of the youth vote. Since then, she's done nothing but fail us. The cost of living has gone through the roof. Rampant illegal migration has left us unsafe and has priced us out of just about everything. And expanding global conflicts mean that we as a generation are this much closer to having to fight and die in wars overseas. This country was so much better off under President Trump's leadership. The cost of living was far lower. Immigration was controlled, and the world was at peace, all of which have been reversed by Kamala Harris. I'm looking forward to getting into this and so much more tonight.
All right, as promised, I want to start with the economy. You pointed to a poll, Mr. Phillips. When you do polling of Gen Z voters, the number one issue among Gen Z voters is the same number one issue as it is for all voters. It is the cost of living. So this basically is a form of a question you'll both be answering. But to you, Mr. Phillips, what is it in the Republican plan that you believe can actually bring the cost of living down, particularly for young voters?
Well, what's been going on just the last 4 years, to be precise, has been a rampant increase in the cost of living. It's completely unaffordable to buy basic living expenses, to get rent. I rent right here off campus. The rent has gone up every year. It's a challenge, and we have to ask ourselves, where does that come from? It comes from a lot of places, a lot of factors have contributed to it, but probably the single biggest factor, aside from inevitable COVID effects, has been rampant government spending. The American Rescue Plan and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is probably the most obtuse name for a bit of legislation in American history. Some people have called it the Inflation Explosion Act. Those two acts have ultimately accounted for, a new report just came out, about half of our inflation in the last 4 years. Those two pieces of legislation were championed by the Biden administration and Kamala Harris. What we need to do, what President Trump will do for us, and especially for Gen Z voters, Gen Z Americans, will be to reduce inflation through curtailing government spending, through increasing and encouraging energy production, and through various other tax incentives, particularly with regard to housing, especially incentivizing potential builders to build new housing through tax breaks. Those are the primary components of President Trump's plan.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Ms. Davis, a form of the same question, though, is what is the Democratic plan to bring down costs, and do you accept the premise that it was Democratic policies that did increase the current cost of living? And I will note that the clock has been at a minute, but as you know, you get the extra 30 seconds as well. Just I didn't want you guys to get confused. Great. We have made it a full minute 30. So, Ms. Davis, if you could answer the question. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I reject that second premise, but let me answer the first question. For young Americans, prices are way too high. Kamala Harris knows this. And before you let a candidate's empty rhetoric decide the fate of your bank account, I encourage you to actually look at the policies that both candidates are proposing. When expert PhDs in economics do this, 23 Nobel laureates find that Kamala Harris's plan is vastly superior to that of Donald Trump's. Why, you might ask? Well, first of all, Kamala Harris is going to lower prices by going after price gouging. In 2021, we saw prices skyrocket as companies took advantage of COVID supply chain disruptions and changing consumer behavior to hike up prices and give themselves historically fat profit margins. An example of this is Tyson Foods, who at the latter half of 2021 doubled their profit margins when Americans were going home hungry. Kamala Harris will put an end to that BS behavior. Number two, Kamala Harris is going to put cash in the hands of everyday Americans. Firstly, she's going to make sure that anyone who makes under $400,000 a year receives a tax decrease of 2.6% to 7%, depending on their income. Unlike Donald Trump, who is only going to be raising taxes for the richest among us and paying for it by raising taxes on the lower and middle income Americans. Lastly, Kamala Harris is going to be reducing costs for young people by helping us where we're hurting the most, on housing, healthcare, education, and more. Thank you.
I want to follow up with both of you with 30 seconds on each of you. I want to first, Mr. Phillips, have you address how can you be sure that the tariff proposals that former President Trump is proposing doesn't have an adverse effect on cost of living and doesn't end up raising our cost of living rather than lowering it?
Certainly. Well, it's a very important question that you bring up. We have to analyze tariffs, and too many people don't actually understand tariffs or how they work. There are arguments on both sides with regard to free trade or for protectionism. I want to argue to you tonight that protectionism, especially with regard to tariffs on American manufacturing, are what we need to embrace in our country today, especially for Gen Z and for the forgotten people of this country. Our manufacturing base has crumbled for the last 10, 20, 30, even close to 50 years. We've seen manufacturing jobs leaving this country because of corporations that have sold out the American people in favor of globalism. What Donald Trump is going to do to bring jobs back to this country is going to be to empower the American worker by placing tariffs on imports from all different sorts of countries, but especially from geopolitical adversaries like China. What we see with tariffs is that on the left, it's actually, when you think of liberal free trade arguers and economists, they will argue that prices will go up due to free trade, due to tariffs. But the truth is that when we implement tariffs, empirically, we found that those costs go down over as little as a year.
All right.
We'll get into it more moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. I know we had a confusion there.
Yeah.
You'll also get 1 minute, but this will be the last time you guys get 1 minute on the follow-ups. Then we will make it 30 seconds. But for you, I want you to sort of address, how are you going to pay for these proposals, this tax cut? Where does it come from? How do you pay for these proposals in order to if you're putting more people money in somebody's pocket, where's that money coming from?
Sure, thank you for the question. Kamala Harris is going to finally address the corporate tax rate in this country that Donald Trump ruined. He lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. You know what that did? All it did was add $1.8 trillion to our national deficit over a period of 11 years. So that's how she's going to pay for it, with her tax plan. But just quickly to address the points of my opponent, let's get something straight. Donald Trump's tariff plan is to implement a 10 to 20% tariff on all imported goods. This is not a targeted tariff. Kamala Harris is not against tariffs on principle, but this candidate is going to be putting tariffs against not just our adversaries, but our allies. Let's think about what that's going to do for the American consumer. Firstly, that's going to raise the cost of prices of products that they import here today. Studies show that that's projected to cost the average American family $4,000 a year. And the reason for that, additionally, is because we know that when we implement tariffs, we'll see retaliatory tariffs as well. That's going to make small businesses less stable with their exports in this country, and it's also going to reduce price competition, which will incentivize Made in America production, manufacturing people to raise their prices too. So at the end of the day, the American consumer is the one that bears the price tag, no one else.
I am tempted to let this tariff debate go on, because I personally am obsessed with the tariff debate, but I do want to move to student debt. This is a full 90-second question for both of you, and I'm going to let Ms. Davis start here. Why should the federal government forgive student debt? That is the stance of the Biden-Harris administration. Why should that be the case?
The federal government should relieve student debt because it's not just the fair thing to do for students, but it benefits us all. When students are trapped in debt, it means that they can't contribute to our economy. It hurts their ability to start small businesses, to expand their families, and to use their extra resources to add surplus into our economy. And let me just tell you a little bit about Kamala Harris's plan on the education front. She knows that as young people, education is the cornerstone to getting the career paths that we hope for. And in addition to continuing fighting the Biden-Harris agenda, which is going to continue on lowering or forgiving debt for 5 million Americans in this country, she is going to be having historic investments that will allow us to finally have free community college for every young person in this country. She is going to be investing in vocational training programs and putting historic amounts into historically black colleges and universities because she knows that that's where some of our finest leaders come from. Ultimately, at the end of the day, my opponent is going to get up here and argue that this was an unrealistic plan and that it added to our deficit. But if you want to compare the Biden record and the Trump record, look at the numbers. Donald Trump added more to our deficit than any other president in history besides George W. Bush and Lincoln. But he wasn't fighting a civil war and he wasn't involved in 2 global conflicts. Thank you.
So, Mr. Phillips, the same topic, which is this. Why shouldn't the federal government essentially subsidize youth education?
Well, let's actually clarify, not just youth education. Of course, we're going to subsidize youth education, K through 12, but with regard to forgiving student loan debt, it's an atrocious plan that is going to bankrupt our country. I hope we get into more moving forward, actually, the looming national debt. What we have is a massive civilizational threat on our hands that the Democrats like to put their heads in the sands about. So we have to get into that shortly. What I'll bring up is this. You're right that Donald Trump wasn't facing a civil war and he wasn't facing two global conflicts. That's because of his success on the global stage. We'll get to that momentarily. In regard to forgiving large amounts of student loan debt, what this amounts to is a regressive tax. What it amounts to is poor Americans who happen to pay their taxes and contribute to the system, who didn't get the opportunity to go to college, then have to pay into the forgiveness of the student loans of those Americans who did go to college and can't cut it. It's poor and it's wrong. And I hope that moving forward, we can realize that hard work is what gets you further and further in this country. When you have, for instance, a gender studies major, right? We like to joke about them. I think it's perfectly fine to do so because plenty of people who get these majors, they ultimately aren't able to find a job. The degrees cost thousands of dollars, tens if not hundreds of thousands, and then who's left to pay for it? People who didn't go to college and who are hardworking and productive. It's unfair.
30-second rebuttal, Ms. Davis. Address this issue, this inequity that has been pointed out, that student debt forgiveness is a benefit if you're going to college, but if you choose not to, you don't get this benefit.
Great. Well, first of all, I'd just like to point out that my opponent at the University of Chicago just challenged the notion of what a liberal arts education should mean. I think it's pretty silly. I know many gender studies majors who are going to go off and do great things. Hi, guys. But what I also think is really important to recognize is that there isn't this imaginary trade-off. This is a selling point that Republicans will try to use to tear us apart. At the end of the day, there are millions of Americans in this country who thought that by getting a degree, they were going to finally get the chance at upward mobility that they were promised. You know, Donald Trump actually started a for-profit institution, Trump University, and in 2017, he had to pay over $21 million in a settlement because he defrauded those students of an actual education while they were trying to better themselves. Let's be frank here. Student loan debt makes us so that we can't contribute to our economy, and it limits us in the future. It's in the government's best interest to help us with it, because then we can contribute to the economy and not be held back by debt that we shouldn't have in the first place.
Mr. Phillips, let me give you 30 seconds here, but try to address this issue. Why shouldn't the federal government be incentivizing young Americans to go to college financially?
Well, the reality, and let me know if we're going to get into the national debt moving forward, because that's a very important issue. I don't know if I have to address it now,
but yours.
Great, we'll talk about it. In terms of looming student debt loans, the entire system is predatory. The entire foundation of it is you have to go to college. You don't get a choice. And by the way, every degree is worth the same. Every degree is going to be just as productive. That's nonsense. When our government incentivizes young people to take out predatory loans and be trapped inside of these agreements when they get degrees that aren't going to be productive and aren't going to get jobs for them moving forward, it is probably the worst thing that they could do to incentivize that further. And that's what's going on Kamala Harris's side.
All right, I'm going to move to what I call the rights section. We're going to deal with reproductive rights and the role of guns and the government's role in regulating guns. But let me start with reproductive rights. Ms. Davis, you brought it up in the opening statement. What is, with a divided Congress, what is realistic that a President Harris could do to, in order to restore reproductive rights for citizens in all 50 states?
Thank you for the question. Let me just take it back for a second. When I was in the 10th grade, I had an opportunity to attend a student protest in response to the wave of anti-choice legislation that swept our nation. And a mentor of mine, someone who I really looked up to, an upperclassman, she took it upon herself bravely to step forward in front of 100 students or so and share that she, unfortunately, was the victim of rape. And in the days that followed, she shared with us that the only thing that got her through it was knowing that she had an option. Donald Trump doesn't want me, her, or you to have that option. Donald Trump's packing of the court with agenda-seeking judges has caused for 64,000 women in the 14 states that have total bans to experience rape-induced pregnancies. It's despicable. Look, to answer your question, Kamala Harris is going to make it a top priority the moment she gets into the White House to codify Roe. And she's going to fight tooth and nail in every state that is making a hurdle for women in this country. Let's talk about some of them. Right now, women who go through a partial miscarriage are being turned away from doctors at their worst time of need. Women in this country who want to have pregnancies are seeing skyrocketing rates of maternal mortality. 1.1 million people have died because of this over 2 years. It's ridiculous. And my opponent, whatever he wants to tell you about it, you can't trust Donald Trump over your body. Thank you.
Mr. Phillips, is Donald Trump comfortable with this idea that a woman has different rights based on what state they live in? And should this be a subject that is left to the states, or should there be a federal floor, if you will, on what is legal and what isn't?
Yeah. Well, Chuck, this is a country where we have a tried and true tradition of federalism. We have a tried and true tradition of states' rights and states acting as independent agents to govern themselves how the people of those states see fit. What Donald Trump did to nominate and get confirmed justices to the Supreme Court, which, by the way, is not packing at all when you consider that we've had 9 justices for many decades, and actually the Kamala Harris campaign has suggested that they pack the court, which is a complete and total threat to our democracy. In regard to nominating and getting confirmed Supreme Court justices for various issues, but we look at abortion, for instance, we look at the Dobbs decision. What that did was overturn the activist precedent of Roe v. Wade, which never should have been the law of the land in the first place. Now, with our system, Donald Trump has done what conservative legal scholars have wanted, what neutral or independent legal scholars have wanted, and even many liberal legal scholars have wanted for generations. What we have now is an environment through which the people actually are empowered to make laws and make decisions about the places they live in. Guess what? We're in the state of Illinois. I don't think that large abortion restrictions are coming down the pipeline soon. With regard to the federal level, Donald Trump is committed to not implementing any abortion bans because he understands that this is now a state issue. It will be decided at the state level, and any sort of discourse otherwise is nonsense.
You get 30 seconds to rebut, Ms. Davis.
At a rally recently, Donald Trump was asked this very question: why has he been back and forth on the pro-life issue? You know what he said? He looked into the camera to the American people and said, "You got to do what you got to do to win elections." That's what Donald Trump thinks about the right to your body. Now, it's offensive to suggest that in this country it's all right for women to not have the option. We know, Chris, that when we ban abortion, we don't end abortion, we just ban safe abortion. We can't do that. We're not going back.
Mr. Phillips, you get 30 seconds.
Sure. Well, that sort of logic completely undermines and ignores the logic of incentives and how they work in this world. Frankly, abortion restrictions do reduce rates of abortion. That is an empirical fact.
That's a lie.
It's been proven time and time again.
Let him finish.
It's not particularly controversial. Certainly wouldn't grow it. You think on the margins here. I'm an econ major at the University of Chicago. It's a phrase we use all the time. Thinking on the margins, it does reduce abortion. Now, with regard to exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother, these are things that are understood by Republicans across the country, as well as Democrats and independents, of course. Right. These are decisions that are compassionate, and these are thoughts that people are taking into account when they decide what the law is going to be in their state.
All right, I'll let you both go 30 more seconds. Go ahead, Ms. Davis.
My opponent just lied to you all. Look it up online after the end of this debate. When we implement extreme abortion bans, the numbers of abortions go up, actually. And we see skyrocketing rates of maternal mortality. I mean, I'm not going to get up here and try to defend the pro-choice stance to you all because I think young people are on my side. I would just encourage you, when you're voting at the ballot box, to not let someone who changes their mood every single day on this issue because of political incentives determine your freedoms, determine the freedoms of your friend. In this country, Everyone should have equal freedoms, and Donald Trump doesn't want women to have those freedoms.
Just the final 30 seconds. Address that final point, which is this disparity between a woman's rights in Texas and a woman's rights in Illinois.
Certainly. Well, if you are going to bring up that abortion rates are going to go up with restrictions to abortion, I think you're going to lose a lot of people, actually. I'm not quite sure how the logic follows in that case, and I'd love for you to have 30 or 90 more seconds to explain that. I don't think it'll be the case. Regardless, what Donald Trump is doing is establishing a playing field where people can advocate within their states for what is right and what is wrong. Donald Trump's position from the very beginning, J.D. Vance's position from the very beginning, has been that we should have compassion for these mothers, these pregnant women, and that we should enable them to have children if it's a concern for them with regard to finances or other shortcomings or challenges. That's what we have to do moving forward.
Let's move to an issue where there's a lot more common ground, guns. And Mr. Phillips, I'm going to start with you. Can the federal government play a role in making students feel safe at schools when it comes to the threat of school shootings?
Sure. Well, we're here at the University of Chicago. I hope we'll get into it later on, but this is the best school in the world. The free speech culture, the academic rigor, and the historical prestige of our econ and political science departments, as well as countless others, really just put us at the top of the pack. That's my opinion, but I don't think it's close. That being said, we do experience challenges. We're located here on the south side of Chicago, where crime rates, admittedly, are fairly high. We have to figure out, what are we going to do about these crime rates? Now, local politicians float gun control. They float taking guns away from people when they can manage. Well, guess what? That hasn't worked. All it's done is make it harder for people to defend themselves in the case of a mugging or other sort of violent crime. Meanwhile, criminals are left to run and roam freely on and around our campus and rob people. With regard to students feeling safe on campus, whether at high schools or at universities or at any other level of education, we need to understand that simply banning guns is unintellectual. It doesn't work, and it merely enables criminals and other violent killers.
Ms. Davis, same question to you. What can the federal government do, in your opinion, or in the Harris plan's opinion, to make students feel safer at school?
Firstly, I'll just address that last point. The gun violence epidemic in Chicago is one that I care about a lot. And my opponent just told you that gun restrictions in Illinois haven't stopped the problem. You know why? Because individuals are still able to get guns in our nearby states who don't have those restrictions. It's pretty easy and pretty simple. When I was doing an internship on Capitol Hill 2 years ago, I was really lucky to do that, I was able to make a really close friend. And my friend shared with me that she was a survivor of the Parkland shooting. And she wasn't planning on going to law school, but she changed her path so that she could make sure that she could fight for a future where she wouldn't have to see another friend like hers be shot down. Kamala Harris doesn't want to take away weapons. Kamala Harris wants common sense principles. 3 things. Firstly, an assault weapons ban. When our founding fathers wrote the Second Amendment, they weren't imagining everyday people being able to grab a weapon of war at Walmart and whip it around wherever they wanted. It's crazy, okay? We shouldn't have those around. Additionally, Kamala Harris wants to implement universal background checks so that someone who maybe has a history of domestic violence on their record or has been convicted of a violent crime, right? They shouldn't probably have their hands on a weapon again so they don't repeat their offense and maybe kill someone this time. And lastly, Kamala Harris wants to implement red flag reforms that will make sure, for example, that someone who is experiencing depression can have a court potentially take a gun away from them so they don't have to hurt themselves, unlike the 27,000 people a year who die by suicide through firearms.
All right,
Thank you.
for these next, I want to go 30 seconds for each of you. Mr. Phillips, is there a gun restriction that you think can work to prevent gun violence?
Well, Donald Trump has actually a history of bipartisanship on several issues. We'll get into criminal justice reform moving forward, but Donald Trump himself advocated for a bump stock ban in the wake of tragic shootings during his administration. Donald Trump recognizes that there is room to create legislation that will actually save lives, but at the same time respect the rights not only of people to carry firearms, but to protect themselves and their family. When you advocate for widespread gun control, what you get is law-abiding citizens, the non-dangerous people, giving their guns up, and you get criminals who, by the way, by their very nature, do not actually respect the law at all, maintaining their gun ownership, and you get a predator-prey situation that's a lot more disparate than if you just allow people to have firearms to protect themselves, their families, their schools, and that you respect the Second Amendment in the way that it was written for this country.
Ms. Davis, what can you do? This is going to be a hard issue to pass any new restrictions in a divided Congress. What can you do outside of Congress to minimize school violence?
Well, first of all, I'll say that the first step is going to have, if we have a president who is in the pocket of the NRA, that might make things a little bit easier. That's what I'd say. Look, Kamala Harris doesn't want to take away guns from people. She believes in the right to defend people, defend yourself. But we right now know that in this country, we have more guns than we have people. It's out of control. Kamala Harris is going to work across the aisle because we know that on this issue, there are many Republicans who agree that someone with a history of domestic violence or someone who's killed someone in the past should not be able to buy a gun again. And I would hope that Republicans across the aisle would agree that someone whose doctor has warned others of a risk of suicide, they shouldn't have a gun either. We should make sure that everyone in this country who is struggling isn't a risk to themselves or others.
All right, I want to move to another pod, what I'm calling the security pod, and we're going to start with the issue of border security and immigration. And I believe in this case, I think, Ms. Davis, you're going to get the first question here. And I'm going to start with, given what Kamala Harris now supports when it comes to border security, should voters see this as an admission that wow. Well, there's a new problem that I've not had before at a debate. Why don't we do that?
Thank you.
Okay.
Don't want to mess up the mullet.
There you go.
Thank you.
And a kind of exciting thing there. Is the fact that Kamala Harris supports this new, tougher border restriction law an admission that the initial immigration policy of the Biden-Harris administration in the first 2 years was a failure?
First of all, Kamala Harris knows that Americans are concerned about the border. And I know Chuck wants for me to say that it's all her fault, like my opponent will too. But let me tell you, because we're done thinking about the past, what we're going to be doing for the future. Kamala Harris knows that a problem as big as the migrant crisis cannot be solved by bullying those around us. It needs to be solved through unilateral compromise. That's why when she was in charge of diplomacy between the Northern Triangle and Mexico, she came up with creative solutions like getting $5.1 billion in private investment to spur job growth and economic stability in those regions. What we're seeing now is migrants from Mexico and the Northern Triangle dropping in their crossing patterns of up to 81%. She's going to continue that, and she's going to address and do the same thing in South America where we're seeing the surge. But let me just get something straight. Kamala Harris and President Biden had a plan to address immigration in this country. They were going to pass the most comprehensive immigration bill in our nation's history. This bill, which was written by one of the most conservative senators in the US Senate, was going to finally give Border Patrol the personnel and the resources they've been asking for years to secure our border. You know what happened? It was passed the House, it was poised to pass the Senate, and Donald Trump knew that if that bill was passed, it would block his path to victory. So he killed it. Donald Trump doesn't want to solve solutions. He simply wants to run on problems.
Mr. Phillips, in fact, to address that, when Donald Trump was elected president the first time, he had a Republican House and a Republican Senate. And he was not able at all to do anything to fix these larger long-term problems with the bill. The problem that the bill that Ms. Davis just referenced seemed to address. Why should voters trust that Mr. Trump is serious about dealing with this if he didn't do it the first time he was in office?
Well, when Donald Trump wins in a week, I believe he's going to win, he's going to have a mandate from the American people to solve this problem. Back when he won in 2016, moving into January of 2017, illegal immigration was not a crisis to the degree that it is now. Millions and millions and millions of illegal immigrants, people we don't know where they come from, we don't know what their background is, we don't know where they're coming from. They are coming into this country and the border is wide open. It's wide open, and I'll articulate how that's the case. Joe Biden, supported by Kamala Harris, on day one, removed Remain in Mexico. The policy that Donald Trump had was that migrants, when they came to the border, were to remain in Mexico while their asylum claims were adjudicated. Joe Biden, in order to chart a new path, in order to open America up, Joe Biden in a presidential primary in 2019 or 2020 for that cycle said, we need to surge the border. That's what he said. That's exactly what they've done. You've had millions and millions of illegals coming in at a rapid rate with no sign of stopping. Now, what Senator Langford did with that bill, I don't know what this joker is thinking to sponsor a bill like that. This bill had baked into it a 10,000 illegal migrant per day cap. What is that? 3.65 million illegal immigrants a year? For Kamala Harris and Joe Biden to basically sabotage our democracy by letting in millions and millions of illegal immigrants and then to slap a Band-Aid on it with the support of some dopey conservative senator, that's an insult. That's an insult to the American people who expect that their government is going to work for them, that their government is going to put their interests first. It's completely illegitimate, and now that Donald Trump is going to have that mandate, he will seal the border, he will deport the people, starting with the murderers, the rapists, and the criminals who should not be here, and he will make this country safe again.
Let me ask you both to address the following question, 30 seconds each. Do we have enough immigrants in this country? Do we let enough immigrants in?
Okay, I'm just going to quickly respond to what my opponent just said. First of all, migrants are half as likely to commit violent crimes than U.S. citizens. Second of all, President Biden and Harris ended the Remain in Mexico plan because the plan that Trump negotiated through bullying Mexico and pressuring them through tariffs, by the way, was leaving migrants to die without resources and being attacked and manipulated and assaulted by smugglers. Can we have any humanity in this country? Let me just quickly say that Donald Trump in 2016 said that he was going to enact a mass deportation plan. He didn't, but you know what that would mean? It would mean that 5 million American children who are in mixed status households would not have caregivers. It would mean that your friends, your neighbors, your relatives would have people knocking at their door and ripping them out of their homes. What world? Is that America? We are a country based off of a foundation of immigrants. My family immigrated here. I imagine that, Chris, at one point your family immigrated here too. It's obscene.
Mr. Phillips, go ahead and respond to that.
Well, Kate brings up that supposedly migrants are half as likely to commit crimes as Americans are. I find that really hard to believe, but I'll actually bring this up. It doesn't matter. One killing, one rape, one incidence of theft is too much. People who shouldn't be in this country in the first place and then commit a crime, that's what's really obscene. In regard to the humanity, the supposed humanity of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's open border policy, right now the DHS is reporting that record numbers of young girls are being trafficked for sex and for other operations. That doesn't sound like humanity to me. When we close the border, when we get a grip at the southern border as to what's going on, we're able to protect everybody's rights instead of exacerbating this humanitarian crisis for political purposes.
Mr. Phillips, does the Republican agenda support a pathway to citizenship for so-called dreamers?
Well, that's actually a great point. Donald Trump actually argued for a deal for dreamers for some time in the early part of his first term. The Democrats weren't willing to give it to them because they wanted to leave the border wide open. That's a fact. You can look it up. Donald Trump is sympathetic to those young people who have been put in a tough situation. What he's going to look for moving forward is the priority number one is to remove violent criminals, to remove murderers, rapists, thieves, burglars, violent criminals from this country. That has to be step number one. Looking at dreamers, looking at people who have been in this country since they were a toddler, that's something to be looked at, but we can't even talk about that until Democrats agree to seal the border and stop this flood of mass migration, which is totally unethical and unconstitutional.
Ms. Davis, is there a compromise on border security that could also ensure a pathway to citizenship?
Yes, there is a compromise.
For these dreamers that have now been in this country for a couple of decades?
Restart my time, please. Thank you. There is a compromise. First of all, Donald Trump is trying to rip us apart on this issue because if he actually cared, he would have done what he said he was going to do at the time. right? He built 51 miles of a wall that smugglers can saw through. It was a symbolic wall, not an actual wall to seal off our borders. And beyond that fake wall and mass deporting people, he doesn't have a single long-term solution. As I said before, the way to solve the migrant crisis is through diplomacy. It's through long-term economic stability in the regions where people are coming from. And lastly, I'll just say this. Can we all just be people? I mean, I know you guys, when you walk around the city of Chicago, and if you've encountered a person who migrated here, who do you see? You see a young mom, maybe with an infant. You see someone like you who was forced to leave a situation because they had no other option. It's sickening to me that the solution to the immigration problem that we are all talking about is mass deportation. You know what that would do to the American economy? First of all, it would lead us to a recession bigger than the Great Depression, because undocumented people are integral to our social revenues and to workforce shortages in this country. Thank you.
I'm glad you agree we need a stronger border wall. That's something we got to prioritize moving forward.
Very quickly, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to respond to her point that if you deport all these migrants, it actually is going to have a huge negative impact on the American economy. How do you prevent that?
So Democrats love to bring up this notion that illegal immigration is essential for our society to run, for our civilization to function. I then ask, how did we come to be such a strong country in the first place? They'll say, oh, a certain proportion of the workforce in this country in construction is made up of illegals. A certain proportion of the workforce in this country with regard to agriculture is made up of illegals. How did we build homes? How did we pick crops and get them to people prior to this massive surge of illegal immigration we've had over the last maybe 40 to 50 years? The answer is, we did it ourselves. We did it by letting people into this country on our terms. Kate's right, we have a tradition of immigration in this country, but it has to be on our terms. We have to know who's coming in, and it has to benefit us. It's not the other way around.
All right, let's move to America's place in the world. I've got to shorten things a little bit because we're running a little short on time. So let's start with Ukraine. Why is defending Ukraine in America's best interest, and should Kamala Harris get elected, why should Americans continue to support Ukraine in this war with Russia?
Thank you. Savvy, a potential best friend, someone doing a good job. These are all words and phrases that Donald Trump has used to refer to Vladimir Putin. Kamala Harris knows that Russia is one of the greatest threats to American national security. And in addition to supporting the will of the Ukrainian people because it's the right thing to do, she also knows that giving as much aid as needed to Ukraine is in the best interest for American people. Look, guys, we're the young ones here. We're the ones who are going to be in this world for the longest. And if we allow Russia to plow over Ukraine and don't send a message that the US, with the strongest military in the world, isn't going to bat an eye like what Donald Trump wants to do, well, they're going to not stop there. They're going to continue on to the Balkans. We need to have a global order where countries like Russia know that the US will make them respect state lines. Thank you.
Mr. Phillips, Mr. Trump has said that he thinks if he gets elected, he can somehow end this war in Ukraine. If the war ends with Ukraine giving up territory, how is that good for America?
Sure. Well, I'm confident that he will. I'm confident that he will. He says he'll do it in the first 24 hours. Let's open it up a little bit. I think within the first year of his term, and probably even sooner than that, he will end the war in Ukraine. Now, we have to get back to brass tacks, which is that all of the chaos, all of the wars, all of the conflicts that have occurred across the globe over the last 3.5 years have been the fault of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. With regard to the disastrous pullout from Afghanistan, that was a botched effort if I ever saw one. That was probably the most embarrassing foreign policy moment in American history. It's up there with the fall of Saigon. We see that opened the door for Russia to invade. Now, I don't believe Putin is our friend. Donald Trump certainly would not say that Putin is our friend. But the nicest thing would be if we could get along with Russia, if we could get along with other countries so that we don't inch closer and closer, as the Democrats are excited to do, to war. Who goes to war, let me ask you? Is it the old folks calling the shots up in Washington? It's not. It's me. Sorry. May sound a little selfish, but it's me, it's my peers at this university, and Kate, it's your party that wants to send you with me. I would hate for that to happen, genuinely speaking. If I'm fortunate enough to have a daughter one day, I would be very frustrated if that were to happen. But it's what happens when we get weak leadership.
Donald Trump doesn't have a foreign policy strategy. He has his daily mood, okay? Kamala Harris is someone who has made the law as a U.S. Senator, someone who has prosecuted those who have violated the law as Attorney General, and someone who has overseen the law as Vice President. She is going to ensure that, unlike Donald Trump, who brags about texting the Taliban and looks up to Kim Jong-un, adversaries are going to look at the U.S. and know that they have to keep their behavior in check.
I want to move to the Middle East, and Mr. Phillips, I want you to address this. Should the United States, under a Trump administration, continue to push for a two-state solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
When I look at what's going on in the Middle East, it's just so pathetic and despicable. It's just so, the scale of the casualties, the scale of the destruction is unreal. That goes for the Israelis, that goes for the Palestinians, that goes for other countries in the region that have been destabilized due to various factors which we'll get into. With regard to pushing for a two-state solution, right now, it's sort of up in the air, to be honest. We don't really know what's going to happen with the conflict in Greater Israel. What happened on October 7th was gross, was horrible. You'd have to be crazy to disagree with me on that. What's going on in Gaza is obviously less than ideal, but it's just a very tense dynamic. It's a very tense relationship right now with what you have to do to eliminate Hamas. Ultimately, peace is a long ways away, I think, unfortunately, in the Middle East. And who started it? Whose watch was it under? The eruption of this recent conflict, it was Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, another episode of their weak leadership on the world stage.
Ms. Davis, is there any limitations that the United States should put on Israel in its military campaign?
Look, first of all, I'm just going to say that Chris and I are in no position to try to even characterize the pain that's happening in the Middle East. I'm also not going to get up here and say that my candidate, certainly not Donald Trump, have a great solution to this conflict. They certainly do not. So as the young person in the audience watching, I encourage you to look at the facts as I have. One candidate in this race has called for a ceasefire. That's Kamala Harris. Donald Trump last week called Netanyahu, trying to govern over a country he's not in charge of, which is illegal, by the way, and he told Netanyahu to do whatever he needed to do. He didn't criticize Netanyahu for not bringing the remaining hostages home, for not stopping unnecessary murder of people in Gaza, and for not stopping democratic erosion in the state of Israel, which undermines the will of the Israeli people because 2/3 of the country want Netanyahu out. At the end of the day, play the probability game. Who do you trust to force Netanyahu to the negotiation table and actually sit down with the stakeholders involved and get peace? Someone who has a foreign policy plan or someone who has an ego and a daily mood and sole political agenda motivations? Thank you.
You'll have to let me jump in here because what's going on, you have to look at results. You can look at rhetoric. You can look at how Donald Trump makes you feel. I'm not going to stand here and tell you, you have to like Donald Trump for his personality. I happen to like him and appreciate those things about him. You don't have to. What you have to do is recognize that on the global stage, Donald Trump's results were, bar none, the greatest that we've probably had in decades. You look at North Korea. President Obama told Donald Trump on their transition that North Korea was the most likely power with which he was going to get into a conflict. Guess what? He went to North Korea and spoke with him. We believe in diplomacy. We believe in discourse and discussion and negotiation. We don't believe in escalating conflicts so that you and I have to go fight and die for the interests of the military-industrial complex and for the interests of the people who call the shots in Washington.
All right, we're going to get to closing statements in a minute, but I both want you to address this final question. If your candidate wins, half the country's going to be upset. What is the best way that you believe you can reach out to the losing side if you win? Ms. Davis, if you could address it first, and then Mr. Phillips.
Kamala Harris is making a to-do list. Donald Trump has made his enemy list. If you go on Truth Social tonight, you're going to see that consistently, over and over again, He's called the US people the enemy from within. He's called us, young students who disagree with him, the enemy. And he's threatened again and again to use the power of the US military and the Department of Justice to go after those that he doesn't agree with. If you don't believe me, take the words of John Kelly, the man who spent the more time with Donald Trump than anyone in the White House as chief of staff. You know what he said recently? He came forward because he couldn't have it on his conscience that Donald Trump told him that he wanted generals more like Hitler's. Look, I'm not up here to call Donald Trump a fascist, even if I believe he isn't one, because I think American people are tired of the name calling. But what I will tell you is that you need to look at the facts. Kamala Harris knows that Americans aren't happy. That's why, as you can all see, she's pushed her agenda somewhat a little bit more towards the middle. But I encourage you to think about the future as young people for the values we want in this country. Do we want values where we can continue disagreeing civilly? Or do we want a country where someone like me is fearful to get up here and shit talk Donald Trump?
Mr. Phillips, basically the flip of the question, if Mr. Trump wins, what kind of guarantees can you make that he's actually going to want to reach out to the half that doesn't support him and govern for the half that doesn't support him?
You'll notice that a theme that I've brought up with you tonight is that of unity through success. Donald Trump is going to make this country great again. During his administration, our quality of life went up on almost every single metric imaginable. What we have on the other side is disunity. We have division. We have grievance politics. We have identity politics. Donald Trump is above that. He wants what's best for all Americans. He wants what's best for Black Americans, for white Americans, for Hispanics, for Asians. He doesn't discriminate based on race. He doesn't discriminate based on gender or sexual orientation or any of it. Attend one of his rallies if you get the chance. You'll see people from all walks of life, from all different places, all different parts of the country, all different national origins, who go to see him because they believe in his vision. They believe in his vision to lower the cost of living. They believe in his vision to lower illegal immigration and keep us safe. They believe in his vision to further the aims of world peace. These are priorities for Donald Trump, and these are priorities for people of all walks of life. And when he makes this country great again, we can all get behind that.
I did have a lot of other questions on a lot of other issues, but unfortunately, we have a limited amount of time. So we are going to go to closing statements. You each get a minute for that. And in that sense, I think due to the coin flip, Ms. Davis, you go first with your 1 minute closing statement.
As Maya Angelou said, when people show you who they are, believe them. To this day, Donald Trump and his running mate have refused to say that they will accept the results of this election if they don't win. That's not belief in democracy. That is self-interest. I am so proud to be up here on this stage, publicly disagreeing with Chris tonight. And when he goes off to vote for Donald Trump next week, unless maybe I convinced him, I will respect him in his decision, and so will Kamala Harris, because we believe in the promise of American democracy. We believe in the strength that comes from healthy debate. You might have not bought anything I said on stage tonight. You might be disagreeing, but I hope you know that in this election, we are voting for the ability to continue disagreeing. We are voting for the ability to get on a stage like this one and tell each other what we think and not be scared to go home at night because the IRS or the military or the Department of Justice is going to be knocking on our door. Join me in voting for Kamala Harris to protect our democracy. Thank you.
All right. And Mr. Phillips, your 1 minute closing statement.
Well, thank you, Chuck. Thank you all again for coming here. This has been an amazing event. For far too long, our politicians, especially those in the Democratic Party, have relegated the interests of the American people to little more than an afterthought, and especially those of Gen Z. In 2015, Donald Trump dared to challenge that. Ever since he came down that escalator, Donald Trump has faced attacks on all fronts. They've tried to tarnish his reputation. They've weaponized the justice system against him, trying to go after his family, his assets, and just a few months ago, an attempt on his life came within half an inch of killing him, with just another attempt on his life happening last month. But it has never deterred him. He believes in this country. He's fighting for us. He doesn't need this. He should be on an island somewhere, enjoying his retirement. Donald Trump has sacrificed so much personally because he loves this country and he's fighting for its future and for our future. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to questions.
All right. How about a round of applause for Kate Davis and Chris Phillips?
Thank you.
Get over here. Yeah. Look at that. They hug. Trump and Kamala don't hug. I don't think we'll ever see Trump and Kamala hug. No. You know. But hey, hope springs eternal. So we are going to spend the last 15 minutes more of in a Q&A. I think there's some rules to the road over here. There's a mic that you line up behind. We are all available to answer questions. I only critique my performance, not theirs. How's that? Pick on me, not them.
You can critique my performance.
All right.
Please do. Feel free.
But with that, we will go with the first questioner. Go for it.
Hi, Kate. Hi, Chris. You guys did great. So according to the Washington Post, Donald Trump lied over 30,000 times during his 4 years in office. We attend one of the most academically rigorous institutions in the world, and we're constantly being pushed to pursue the truth. How can you argue that Donald Trump is the best candidate for Gen Z when he can't be trusted to tell the public the truth?
So let me guess. Is that a question for Chris or Kate? Go for it, Chris.
Yeah.
Try to address it.
Well, thanks, Alyssa. I appreciate you coming out here and asking that question. I have a belief that Donald Trump didn't need this life. He didn't need to become a politician. He had it made. As I just articulated in my closing statement, he should probably be out on a beach somewhere enjoying his retirement. Now, I think it's crazy to imagine a politician lying, right? It's crazy to imagine a politician lying. Every politician lies, and I'd love to see a metric for Joe Biden. I'd love to see a metric for Kamala Harris presented in tandem. If anyone has that, please bring it up. Now, with regard to him being a non-truth teller, I think it really gets down to what's going on with the mainstream media. The mainstream media, the legacy liberal media, have treated Donald Trump unfairly from the very beginning. You'll see clips of him going on The View with all different sorts of people, all different sorts of shows, and they've been his best friends. Then, when he announced that he was running for president to put the interests of the American people first, people got bitter. People in the mainstream media suddenly turned against him. They found it repulsive. What's going on with the mainstream media, even today, is incredibly dishonest and unethical. We'd have to look at exactly the metrics by which that note was made. I really doubt that it's gotten that high. I do. I believe that his plans are the best for this country. With regard to the truth, you have to look at who's judging the truth. You have to look at who is the arbiter of truth. We've had those discussions on this campus before, actually, about people in the mainstream media lying. You look at the Jussie Smollett hoax, you look at the Russia collusion hoax, you look at smearing Justice Kavanaugh as a rapist, you look at smearing Nick Sandmann as a white supremacist, and you look at completely refusing to look at the Hunter Biden laptop story, which probably would have swung the results of the 2020 election. It's important to understand that we're dealing with a biased press in this country who, frankly, have nobody to blame but themselves for the credibility that they've lost.
The weaponization of attacking the press. I am not a participant in this debate, other than to say fact-checking Donald Trump is like trying to clean up after your dog when he's had diarrhea. At some point, there's just nothing you can do. Next question.
My name is Jamil Jackson. I'm a fourth year. I'm from the Chicago Thinker, and I do want to follow up on Chris's point, because we can't have this conversation divorced from the media and where we get most of our thoughts from. Mm-hmm. So my question is for you, Chuck Todd. Mm-hmm. Your network, NBC, is now covering Elon Musk more than it does Biden and the 10 other billionaires supporting Kamala Harris. Mm-hmm. 85% of your coverage is negative against Trump, whereas 78% is positive for Kamala Harris. Your network publicly shamed Ronna McDaniel and fired her for being an election denier. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, you guys spent hundreds of hours peddling the Russian disinformation collusion hoax. Your network, and this is the most hard-hitting one, refuses to cover the sexual assault allegations against Doug Emhoff. So how can Gen Z voters trust what your network says on either candidate, given that discrepancy?
Look, we just cover facts. And if we're able to uncover facts, we cover it. As for the Russian collusion, I'm not going to sit here and defend what opinion hosts do. That is what it is. I always say this, I'm stuck covering the politics as it is, not as I wish it were. Obviously, we're a huge news division that has a lot of different aspects to it, MSNBC, CNBC, Telemundo, as well as NBC News. So, one person's negative coverage of something is is a subjective thing. What somebody views as negative coverage, if they point out something that seems to be unpopular, is another person's just basic fact that if something's unpopular. So I don't know what to tell you about that. As for Elon Musk, he's one of the 5 people that controls the distribution of information in this country. So I could argue he actually does deserve a much larger share of attention, as do Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, as does the head of Google, as does the head of Amazon. These are the entities that are doing more to misinform Americans with the way the algorithms work than anything one single news division can do. I sit here, I don't control my distribution. It gets weaponized and clipped, and and so when you have that situation, you get to the point where you essentially have this broken information ecosystem creating sort of these crazy statistics that you're able to quote from very partisan organizations that create these statistics. I think you got that one from Media Research Center, which is a very far right-wing organization that only views any criticism as if you criticize the conservatives, you must be liberal. I sit here and criticize liberals and conservatives. I'm neither. And everybody seems to struggle when we try to actually hold both sides accountable, and everybody just wants to hear the negative that they receive and assume that the other side's not getting it. So I do think some of this is an inability for people to see the entire picture. But I'm not going to sit here and debate every single thing that has been said on an NBC-owned airwave, because I can't defend everything that has been said on an NBC-owned airwave, for what it's worth. I can only defend what I've done and what I've been a part of, and I'm happy to answer any of those individual questions about my role, my journalism, and the questions that I've asked. So let me take the next question.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan. I'm a first year in the college. Chris, this question is for you. Donald Trump has refused to acknowledge that he lost the 2020 election, and he has refused committing to respect the results of this election if he loses. How can you say that he is fit to be the president of the United States if he refuses to respect the Constitution and the fundamental right of the people to choose their president?
Certainly, well, I can talk about all kinds of ways that Donald Trump respects the Constitution, respects our system that is not a pure democracy, but that, of course, has many democratic elements instilled within it, and ways that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have completely disparaged the Constitution, have shown a complete lack of regard for what it means for our country. You just look at their proposals to pack the court, to eliminate the filibuster, to ram their radical agenda down Americans' throats. I see a much broader concern coming from our side with regard to how they impact the democracy, how they impact the functioning of this country and of our government, than you see from our side. So you see those challenges to our democratic system coming from the left. With regard to the right and with Donald Trump's view, and I'll just share a bit of my personal view on the 2020 election, there were obviously discrepancies with vote counts in 2020. But what's more important to acknowledge with regard to the illegitimacy of the 2020 election is actually the censorship and the stopping of the free flow of information that occurred during those months in the depths of the COVID pandemic. What you had was government agencies, the White House, the FBI within the DOJ, you had HHS communicating with then Twitter, with Facebook, with other media organizations, pressuring them to censor critics of the administration's policies. And guess what? Those social media companies, out of fear for their own viability as organizations and as companies and as businesses, they went right on board with what happened, with the censorship that was administered by the federal government. In addition, going back to a topic that we've discussed at length here this evening, with the bias from the legacy media and with the refusal to cover the Hunter Biden laptop story, which polls show would have swung the results of the election in favor of Donald Trump, the blatant disregard for what happened, and legacy media journalists talking about hoaxes basically every day, bringing up something new about how Donald Trump told people to inject bleach. There are plenty of hoaxes, plenty of comments that have been taken by liberal media when they take 3 or 4 words out of context. You don't have a free flow of information. The central component of a democracy is the free flow of information so that people are empowered to choose their leaders according to who they think is best for them. What you had during 2020 is anything but.
For what it's worth, the Hunter Biden laptop story was circulated in the public, and everybody seemed to find out about it. Next question.
That wasn't until after the election.
No, it was before the election. It was,
I don't think so.
everybody was, but anyway, that's always, and these are private companies, so I don't, their decisions to do that were their decisions to do that. Whether I would have done it is a different story. Next question.
Hello, everybody. My name is Hassan. I study U.S. history. First of all, you guys are very intelligent and articulate, but I feel like I'm listening to professional politicians when I listen to y'all, which is not a good thing. So I would just...
They were too polished?
No, it's just a lot of talking points and these quick, sharp moves that are playing with your emotions. It's not the best thing. So the United States now for over 2 decades has been in a war on terror that was kicked off by the Bush dynasty. We can set aside the United States' support for the genocide in Gaza for the moment, and maybe I want to hear from both of y'all your perspective on why are United States tax dollars going towards building B-2 bombers that are being used to bomb one of the poorest countries in the world, which is Yemen. And that's bipartisan, and that's been over 4 successive presidencies. And it's based on an alliance with Saudi Arabia, which you guys both talked about democracy, not particularly a democratic country. So how do you justify the fact that both of your parties support bombing one of the poorest countries in the world, and they are doing so as we speak?
Can I go?
Go ahead, you go first, Kate.
Thank you so much for your question. I'm sorry for, not being as real as you were hoping I could be. So let me just try to be real with you right now. I can't justify it. I can't justify everything that the Democratic Party has done, just like I hope my opponent wouldn't do the same for the Republicans. There are so many injustices in this country that enrage me too, particularly on the Yemen front. I agree with you, and I thank you for raising the concern. And at times, it's really hard to stand up here and be ambassador for a party when I definitely will have issues that conflict with my moral values. The reason why I'm up here today is because we've got 2 choices, and that's how our political system works. And unfortunately, even though I don't agree with everything, I agree with a lot more. I agree a lot more with Kamala Harris than I do with Donald Trump. But I thank you for your question, and I encourage you to continue raising your voice and criticizing political leaders on both sides of the aisle for their acts against humanity. And I hope that, if I do one of these ever again, I'll be more real next time.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. Well, the format of the event was more sort of a formal debate. I would love to do a conversation that's a bit more informal and long form, where perhaps we could address some of those things you brought up. I really enjoyed this event, I have thus far, but I do get your point. With regard to the war on terror, and with regard to the trillions of dollars that this country has spent dropping bombs, shooting off guns in the Middle East, you have to ask yourself, at what gain, at what advantage has it been for the United States in doing such actions? And I tend to think that those are very limited. I can tell you right now, we did have to go into Afghanistan after 9/11. Basically, nobody contests that. In about 2004, 2005, when we had a change in the mission into nation building, that was a mistake. When we had people in Washington who got together and lied about what was going on in Iraq, bringing us into that conflict, that was a big, big mistake. And I'm not just saying these things to agree with you, I'm saying them because I believe them to be true. What Donald Trump represents, and excuse me if this sounds like a polished talking point, but I happen to believe it, what Donald Trump represents is a diversion from the Bush-Cheney dynasty, as you put it. Donald Trump got out of Syria. Donald Trump got together the Abraham Accords, which was a huge step towards peace in the region. That region has been hotbox for some time, and no president of the United States is ever going to solve them within one term. But I happen to think that Donald Trump has taken massive strides in the Middle East towards peace and towards global peace, and towards keeping us out of those potential conflicts. That's just the way that I see it. I'm happy to even chat with you afterward on that.
Great. And this is going to be the last question.
Hello, guys. Fantastic job, both of you. Thank you for doing this. It was great to have this kind of environment at a school.
Thank you.
I have relatives who are undecided voters. They both find both candidates difficult to agree with in a lot of ways. My relatives were Republican in the past, and they disagree with some of the policies that Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party has. But they also find it morally unacceptable to vote for someone who has been found liable for sexual abuse in the state of New York. And my question to both of you is, how does your candidate, in a way as a figurehead of the United States, represent a citizen who has characteristics that should be found in an upstanding citizen of the United States, which voters can feel proud to vote for?
I'll answer.
Go ahead.
Go for it.
Sorry, I already cursed tonight. I'm a New Yorker, so I can't help it. And the reason I say that is because I'm not going to go on and list all of the things that Donald Trump has said about women. I encourage you, there's a list of 100. You can find it online yourself. Look, I respect your relatives so much for trying to figure out who they want to vote for and dealing with these conflicting morals and opinions. It's tough, and a lot of Americans are in exactly the same shoes. And I encourage your relatives, at the end of the day, to recognize that, yeah, there are going to be policies that you don't always want to back, but the leader of our country is the leader of our values. And, we're going to have probably a mixed House and a mixed Senate. We're going to see legislation go back and forth and hopefully ended up somewhere in the middle. But I encourage your relatives to vote for a candidate who is someone that you'd want to meet in real life, is someone who you'd be comfortable with your daughter meeting in real life, is someone who you think is at least a fine person. If you look up that list, I think you'll find that Donald Trump isn't.
Well, thank you for that. In regard to undecided voters, it's pretty incredible that there still are undecided voters, I think, with the massive amount of information and to be frank, the differences between the two candidates in regard to personality, in regard to their records and their results. What I would encourage for your relatives to look at, or any undecided voter, especially someone in Gen Z who maybe is new to the political sphere, who hasn't been following politics their entire lives, their admittedly youthful lives, and instead take a quick look at what the results have been of Donald Trump's administration and what the results have been of Kamala Harris's time in office. We've had great peace, and not to beat a dead horse here, but we had world peace, we had a low cost of living, we had economic growth that was super duper strong under Donald Trump, we had immigration that was controlled, and we've seen a great diversion from that in the last 3.5 years. So we can talk about policy and we can talk about personality. What I would say is this: you said we should vote for somebody who you can imagine yourself meeting in person. I actually don't think you necessarily have to have that as your number one concern. I think your number one concern should be who's going to provide for the future of this country, who's going to be sure to enable me to rent a home, to rent an apartment one day, help me start a family. When I look at the other side, when I look at the Democrats, I see a lot of feel-good rhetoric about joy and unity. Actually, the joy has gone away. It's not, there's not a lot of joy anymore. But I see these words, you see these feelings. And if you want to elect a priest, I think you should go to church and talk to the priest. Happen to be a religious person. If you want to elect a president, if you want to elect a leader who's going to deliver results for your country, I think you have to go with Donald Trump on this one.
Okay, everybody, that's a wrap. Another round of applause for Kate, Chris, and Chuck Todd. Amazing, amazing job. Following tonight's program, there will be a spin room for students only, hosted by the IOP Student Advisory Board at the IOP House. Immediately following this debate, head to the IOP House at 57th and Woodlawn after to debrief, enjoy some food and conversation. We're 1 week away from Election Day, and early voting opens tomorrow on campus. If you're a Chicago voter, you can vote early at our on-campus polling location at the Reynolds Club. Lastly, for students, we will be hosting an election night watch party downstairs in the Cloister Club, 6:30 to 10 on election night, November 5th. Join us for pizza and anticipation, and we'll see you then.